To my complete lack of surprise, Arilu already had a room aboard the Worldwounder set up to perform ritual work of the kind the ecclesiarchy wouldn't approve of. We had to move a few pieces of furniture around to clear enough space. Arilu was used to working her heretical sorcery on her own, not with the support of an entire cult of fellow insane followers of the dark gods. I supposed she could have grown such a cult among her crew if she'd wanted, but that would also have made it easier for the Inquisition to realize that something distinctly non-imperial was going on. Admittedly, that risk wouldn't have stopped most followers of Tzinch, but Arelu was a cut above the kind of arrogant fools Jafar spent most of his time managing on Slaukenberg. As they had done before on Slaukenberg and Cassandran, Harold and Christabel got to work. I studiously ignored the whispers I could hear coming from the two of them as they furiously compared notes and murmured something about adjusting the spell to take the motion of the ship into account compared to the otherwise slower, more predictable course of a planet. Arilu had promised not to do any crazy maneuvers until we were done, and that was all the reassurance I was likely to get, so better not think about it. The 9 members of our strike team were arranged inside the ritual circle. The Magi were finishing drawing up on the floor, which was made of a single piece of stone Arielu had apparently brought aboard from some nameless world from beyond the imperial frontier that might or might not have been haunted by the psychic echoes of its human population after they'd accidentally destroyed themselves thousands of years before the Emperor was in nappies by dabbling in sorcery. I couldn't decide if she'd decided to take the stone to remind herself not to get cocky with her rituals, or because it somehow amplified the effect and she'd completely missed the obvious warning the universe had thrown into her face. Despite the presence of 2 Astartes and Althea in the group, I was still the tallest person in the room due to being inside the Liberator armor, fresh out of maintenance after its deployment on Torridon Majoris. I won't say I felt comfortable or confident, because there are lies that are too big even for me. But as Harold, Christabel, and their acolytes began chanting, and the air started to ripple with warp energy as the barrier between materium and immaterium thinned, I felt reasonably certain this part of the plan was going to work, though what we would find on Sol Tapyrp was still anyone's guess. Naturally, it was then that everything went ploin-shaped. As the Magi began to chant, and the air began to crackle with latent warp energy, there was what I can only describe as a sudden darkening of the room. The lumens were still turned on, and the candles and other light sources that had been spread out as part of the ritual were still burning, but my vision was suddenly impaired. Even though I was looking at the room through the Liberator armor, whose sensor suite would have put an Astartes helmet to shame, according to Hector, at least. But then I knew enough about the World Eater's logistic base to take that with a grain of salt. My field of view was becoming shrouded by darkness. "What's happening?" I called out, my voice coming out of the armor's external vox speakers. Given that the Magi were all clearly busy, I didn't really expect an answer, but I got one all the same. "Oh, Cain, you poor, pathetic fool." The voice boomed across the ritual chamber, echoing in ways that sounded wrong to my ear, as if the speaker was standing in a room with completely different acoustics than us. To my dismay, I recognized that voice immediately, and my stomach dropped. "Astyanath," I breathed out. "Yes," the unseen dark apostle replied with mock approval. "Did you really think we wouldn't see this coming, and wouldn't be prepared for it, wouldn't plan for it? We knew you would try teleporting yourself and your retainers across the system once dear Sir Tunoff did as he was told and gave you our warning. You getting predictable, Cain. Whenever you face a challenge with time running out, you throw yourself at it. Your foolish bravery has made you vulnerable, and now you will pay the price for it." I wanted to scream for a great many different reasons. It was one thing for the enemy to anticipate my moves, but another for them to do so by buying into the same lie I'd been selling to the Protectorate for years. Mostly, though, I wanted to scream because I was terrified. I hadn't sensed any deceit from Sertanov during our brief exchange, only grim desperation. But all that meant was that the Brotherhood hadn't shared their full plan with their servant before having him contact me to deliver their message. It was basic information compartmentalization, but the idea that the same lunatics who were willing to fiddle with the Shadowlight so easily could show such tactical cunning had simply failed to occur to me. The Magi started levitating, eyes bulging, blood running from their eyes and noses. "Stay inside the circle," I heard Jürgen shout urgently. Breaking it would unleash all the energy at once. My aide's advice undoubtedly saved my life, as my instincts were screaming at me to get out of the room, even if I had to carve my way through the walls with Liberation's edge. But I trusted Jürgen as much as I trusted anyone, and he knew more about the mechanics of what was happening than I did, so I forced myself to remain immobile, fighting against the unseen psychokinetic forces buffeting my armor to stay upright. Reality splintered, and I fell through the cracks, screaming in terror. This was the third time I was exposed to the warp without the benefits of having a Geller field around me, and it was far worse than the previous 2 times, by far. Whatever the Brotherhood of Darkness's sorcerers had done made the experience go beyond unpleasant and into the realms of purest agony. I couldn't feel Emily's presence shielding me, and the wards on the Liberator's armor blazed hot enough. I felt myself cooking inside my suit. Literally, if the smell of burnt flesh that filled my helmet was anything to go by. I could still hear the incantations of the Magi echoing into the ether, now screamed through bloodied lips as the Slaukenberg cultists fought against the Brotherhood's interference. Their words and voices all seemed to merge together into one great scream of defiance at the abyss as they fought for their souls as well, mine and the rest of my retinues. In the kaleidoscope of impossible shapes and colors which surrounded and leered and clawed and bit at me, I caught a glimpse of a bright silhouette whose light shone through the layer of chains covering it. I tried to reach for it, driven by some instinct so deeply ingrained by the scholar progenium, even all my years of being an unwilling traitor to the God Emperor couldn't erase it. But the silhouette vanished almost immediately, replaced by yet more hungry eyes and leering mouths. And no, I had no idea how that was possible, only that it was. Then, mercifully, it was all too much, and I passed out, fully expecting to wake up either before the Golden Throne in Emily's clutches, or being used as a plaything for the Brotherhood's demon servants. For once, however, I was to be pleasantly surprised, as when my consciousness returned, I was both alive and alone. It took me a moment to realize it, as my mind was still reeling from the experience of being thrown through the warp. But eventually, the mental nausea I felt receded enough for me to slowly force my eyes open and take stock of my situation. I felt that I was laying on some hard surface, no longer inside the Liberator armor. Not for the first time. I was thankful for the abundance of caution that led me to always wear my smaller custom-made suit of power armor before entering the larger one. My helmet, however, hadn't survived the trip to wherever I was. The view screen was badly cracked, impossible to see through. Reluctantly, I sat up and pulled it off, allowing me to see my surroundings clearly. There was stone around me, clearly carved by human hands a long time ago. Enough light came through an opening a few meters away for me to see, and my old hiver instincts told me I was deep underground. The air was stagnant, but there was enough open space that I didn't need to worry about running out of oxygen anytime soon. Judging by how relatively good I felt, physically at least, my armor had injected me with panacea while I was unconscious, though because my helmet had been damaged beyond recovery during the teleportation, I had no idea how much, or to heal what injuries exactly. The latter was probably for the best, as knowing how close I'd come to death wouldn't do anything to calm my nerves. Looking around the small cavern in which I'd awakened, I found the Liberator armor laying nearby, or rather, what was left of it. The Borg's gift to me had been completely wrecked. What parts of it remained, which were large enough to identify, bore claw marks that belonged to no natural creature, and the wards engraved into it had burned out. Clearly, the denizens of the warp had done their best to peel it open like a giorba with a piece of seafood in order to get to me. But the armor had done its job of protecting me from whatever doom the Brotherhood sorcerers had intended for me. I made a mental note to thank the Borgs if I made it out of this mess alive. I found no sign of Liberation's edge. Presumably, the altered piece of Drakari tech the Borgs had fashioned into a giant blade of dark matter had been lost in the warp. Not that I cared too much about it, since using it in battle outside of the Liberator armor was all but impossible. I still had my bolt pistol, and the Slayer sword was still attached to my hip. I felt much less confident about fighting the Brotherhood than I would have inside the Liberator armor, but at least I had weapons that could reliably penetrate Astarte's power armor, so I should be able to shank one to death if I managed to catch them by surprise. I didn't know where the rest of my party was, or if they were even still alive. I hoped they were, if only because that meant I could find some assistance to hide behind. But I had to assume they weren't, and I was on my own. Wait, I nearly knocked myself out as I reflexively tried to slap my forehead before checking the motion. I was a fool. My armor had a built-in Ansible, the result of a lot of effort on the Borg's part to figure out how to build the smallest versions of the Archaeotech devices contained in the STC database recovered during the first expedition aboard Emily's gift. It was far too expensive to build for general use, but the moment the heretics had been confident they could build one, they'd insisted that adding it to the next version of my personal suit of power armor was needed. Rarely had I been happier to have caved in to the Borg's demands than in that moment. Even with the helmet broken, I could still use the Vox receiver in the collar. The Vox speaker was too damaged to function, but fortunately, I knew just enough about the details of the Ansible's use to send a short message to the Worldwounder to inform them that I was still alive, just in case Arilu decided to avenge my perceived death by blasting the planet apart while I was still on it after dealing with the Brotherhood's forces in the void. Within seconds, I received a pulse of confirmation that my message had been received, and a brief text message indicating that while half of the cultists in the ritual chamber had died, both Harold and Christabel were still alive, though wounded and in the Worldwounder's apothecarium. I honestly didn't know how I should feel about that, so I decided not to think about it for now. Apart from that, the void battle had begun. Arilu wished me luck, and I was effectively on my own. I really wanted to simply stay hidden and wait for rescue, But that wasn't feasible. The odds that the Brotherhood sorcerers could track the place where I'd return to reality were too great. I needed to keep moving. Furthermore, the threat of the Brotherhood of Darkness unlocking the secrets of the Shadowlight remained. I hadn't made it 5 meters from my starting point when my collar's display showed a new message. One coming from Kappa. Of course, I thought, with a surge of relief. If anyone would have augmented themselves with an implanted Ansible transmitter linked to the network spanning the Protectorate, it would be them. I made a mental note to make sure every member of the strike force was equipped with an Ansible transmitter. The next time circumstances force me into such a situation, it was perhaps overly optimistic of me to believe I would live long enough to have the opportunity, but refusing to think of the future is just another way to accept death. Liberator, as they wrote. Are you well? I typed, somewhat awkwardly on account of wearing my armor's gauntlets, whose fingers weren't exactly designed for such precision work. Plus you. Several of my systems have been damaged, but I remain operational. I believe the Neverborn, called forth by the Brotherhood to interfere with our teleportation, focused the bulk of their efforts on you. Where are you? I typed. The reply came immediately. Unlike me, Kappa could simply think their reply and have their systems translated into signals for the communicator to send into the Ansible network. That's unclear. Somewhere on the surface, the atmospheric anomalies are interfering with the Vox. I can only pick up Sir Jürgen's signal close by. What about you? Unlike Vox communications, the Ansible couldn't be used to track my location, whether by the Borg or the Brotherhood. It couldn't be intercepted either, so I didn't hesitate in replying. Not sure. Underground. Liberator armor wrecked. Suspect main enemy stronghold. Understood. I will endeavor to join you as soon as possible and gather our companions on the way. Be careful, Lord Liberator. Oh, I would. Of that Kappa could be certain. Once I was sure I wouldn't get surprised by any more sudden communications, I resumed my advance, passed through the entrance of the cavern in which I'd arrived, and froze in stupefaction at the sight before me. For some reason, the Brotherhood of Darkness had thought it was a good idea to build their lair inside a giant pit. They'd carved chambers and passages along the walls of the pit, one of which I'd just come out of. Judging by the large amount of dust my footsteps were disturbing, nobody had been here in centuries. Perhaps it had been used as some kind of storeroom during the stairway's creation. Certainly, that was the most inoffensive purpose I could think of at the time. The source of the light was the dozens of servo skulls with lumens floated up and down the great pit. Most of the ones I could see bore traces of mutations, or had belonged to beasts or abhuman variants I wasn't familiar with. The constant change in light level this caused was nauseating and migraine-inducing for anyone without a helmet to filter it, which I suspected was deliberate on the part of whichever dark brother had set this up. Still, the illumination was still more than sufficient for me to take in the decor, which reminded me of the gaudiest churches of Slaukenberg before the uprising, only with the icons of him on earth replaced by towering statues of each of the dark gods. Immense effigies of Khorne, Tzeentch, Slaanesh, and, of course, Nurgle surrounded the pit, each of them carved of a different material and made to look down with expressions that could only be described as hungry. For one brief, awful moment, I felt certain the statues were staring at me, before I blinked and realized they were instead looking at the bottom of the pit instead. There was something at the bottom of this pit, that much couldn't be denied. Despite not being a psyker myself, I could feel it. A distant pressure, or the heat of a blast furnace, so potent it could still be felt through numerous layers of rockreet. This had to be whatever Harold and Jürgen had sensed, the source of the entire system's strange etheric gravity, which had resulted in the warp currents being so quiet compared to the raging storms surrounding the system. What in the God's name had the Brotherhood hidden down there? I had no desire to know. There were already far too many unholy secrets dwelling inside my brain for comfort. Shaking my head, I resumed my examination of the pit, noticing that I could hear the sounds of industry from several levels above me, and saw crimson light emerge from windows carved into the stone, as well as black smoke escaping from large metal chimneys that ran all the way up to the pit's surface. It made sense. Supplying the Brotherhood with weapons, armor, and ammunition had to require a significant industrial base. And from what Basilius Zeta had learned of studying their captured war gear, they weren't conjuring it out of the warp or some such nonsense. Perhaps they had repurposed the ruins of some dark age of technology manufactorum, or whatever the equivalent of one the ancients had used, or brought their own renegade tech priests to build one from scratch. Regardless, I gave a silent prayer of thanks to whichever deity had ensured I didn't return to reality inside the hell forge of the Brotherhood's pet heretics. Somehow, I doubted they upheld the same standards I had forced on the Borgs in an, admittedly failed, attempt to cripple them. A standard Imperial Mechanicus forge was already dangerous enough. I had no desire to see how much worse its heretical counterpart may be. The top of the pit was lost in the distance, but I was reasonably certain it stretched up for several kilometers at least. I was much closer to the bottom of the pit than its top, and the surface of the ruined world. Far, far above my current level, I could see the shapes of immense bridges that went across the pit, connecting opposing sides. It was hard to be sure from down here, but I was pretty sure none of them had any railings, which would be coherent with the fact the spiraling stairway didn't have any either. Most likely, anyone who slipped and fell was considered unworthy and a sacrifice to the gods. There were only two directions I could go, and down, in addition to bringing me closer to the unnerving thing the Brotherhood were keeping at the bottom of the pit, would only get me further away from potential help. I supposed it was possible another member of my retinue might have appeared further down, but either they would have made themselves known by now, or they would catch up to me eventually. Given the pit's dimension and my current location closer to its bottom, my best shot was to make my way up and try to find the rest of the strike team. Of course, up would also bring me closer to the Brotherhood of Darkness, but the alternative was to stay here, which, despite the ominous feeling I was getting from the bottom of the pit, was a rather appealing prospect. Unfortunately, without my helmet, most of my armor's life-sustaining capabilities were disabled, so I would only become weaker over time. I probably still had a few doses of panacea in my armor, but the Borgs had tested the substance's effects on thirst and hunger, using volunteered and heavily monitored USA troopers, and the results had been, shall we say, mixed. It would keep me alive, but would drain my muscle mass to do so, eventually leaving me barely able to move under my own power. Hardly a desirable outcome in the best of circumstances, let alone when stranded inside the stronghold of a war band of demon-worshipping loonies. I'm sure you'll agree. In addition, despite Astyanath's interference, our initial objective remained as pressing as ever, even more so, in fact, since I was now that much closer to the bunch of lunatics mucking about with the shadow light. So, with great reluctance and clutching my weapons like a child would his blanket while sneaking out of the dorms after curfew, I began climbing up. The stairs had been carved for transhumans and were rather steeper than I was used to, but my power armor let me climb without issue. It became clear that the lower levels of this strange structure were uninhabited, with the warband's activities focused on the upper levels, closer to the surface, and I had a feeling, away from whatever laid at the bottom of the pit. All I saw as I made my way up the stairs were more shrines to the dark gods, none of which looked like anything I would have allowed on Slaukenberg. Ancient yellowed bones were piled up at the foot of 8-pointed stars, and there was a number of steles covered in runes that made my eyes water when I looked at them. It vaguely reminded me of the description I'd read of imperial shrine worlds, where icons and sacred texts would be placed along the roads allegedly taken by saints in millennia past. Of course, in the Imperium, this was mostly done to extort money from pilgrims to fill the ecclesiarchy's coffers. After an indeterminate period of time, it could have been 10 minutes, it could have been an hour. High-stress situations tended to make one's perception of such things unreliable, even outside of active combat. I suddenly heard a voice call out to me, "Lord Cain, is that you?" I paused as I recognized the voice. Still, I didn't lower my weapons, just in case this was some kind of trick, and called out, "Sieur Tarek." The beastkin emerged from behind a stone colonnade, sculpted in a demonette's likeness, looking very relieved to see me. A quick look at him didn't reveal any injuries. He was wearing the same primitive but efficient combat uniform the male beastkin fighters had worn on his people's moon in Torridon, which was scratched and pierced through in several places. So he probably had been injured, but not badly enough that he had been unable to inject himself with panacea. Remembering the state of the Liberator armor, I felt vaguely envious, but crushed the emotion as completely useless. "I'm glad to see you," he admitted, without hesitation, which was fair enough. Frankly, the fact he wasn't freaking out was already more than I'd expect from someone who had basically been a civilian until a few months ago. Out of the other 8 members of the strike team, the Beastkin Prophet wasn't the one I'd have preferred to find, but I wasn't going to look a gift equine in the mouth. Image or no, I wouldn't have let him come along if I hadn't thought he could be useful, and having someone who could predict the future, if not in a fully conscious manner, could only help increase my chances of survival. If nothing else, another pair of eyes and a body to put between me and the Dark Brothers couldn't hurt. "I've made contact with the fleet," I told him. "The Void battle is going well. I've also been in touch with Tessel and Kappa. They're somewhere on the surface, as well as Jürgen. As for the others, I don't know. But the fact you're here gives me hope they are close at hand as well." "That's good to hear," he sighed, before looking up with apprehension. "I've been staying on this level since I woke up and saw all of this," he finished, gesturing at the immensity of the pit. "Now that you're here, I'm guessing we're going up to stop the Brotherhood." "Not exactly," I replied. I hesitated briefly, unsure how to spin this, before deciding on something close to the truth. The two of us cannot take on the entire Brotherhood on our own. We need to see if any of the others made it here and join forces first. Then we'll see how best to proceed from there." "Good plan," the Prophet said with a nod. I would have felt more reassured if I didn't know he was the kind of person who felt launching himself at a Chaos Marine with no weapon on his person was a reasonable course of action, but I had to trust he wouldn't do anything foolish that would get us both killed. Let's go then. Together, we resumed our ascent. Tarek wasn't as used to sneaking around as I was. Even after all these years as the figurehead of a heretic rebellion, the instincts of my childhood were still strong. But he also wasn't wearing a suit of power armor, which, no matter how advanced the STC had been built from, wasn't exactly designed for stealth. Thus, I would be hard-pressed to say which one of us was to blame when we got spotted. In the defense of whoever it was, it had been more or less inevitable. The path we were walking didn't exactly have many hiding spots. There was a shout coming from above in that deep voice that nobody who has ever heard it can mistake as anything other than a space marine. Startled, we looked up toward the source of the noise. To my horror, I saw that a dark brother had jumped down from a higher level, crimson eye lenses glowing as he stared at us, his faceplate somehow conveying the bloodlust of its wearer perfectly. He smashed into the stairs right before us, and for one heart-stopping moment, I feared the impact would cause the entire stairway to collapse, sending us all toppling to our doom below. It didn't, though, which left me to deal with the issue of the transhuman killing machine in front of me. In one hand, the Dark Brother was holding a roaring chainsword, while the other held a bolt pistol that made the one I was carrying look like a child's toy. Even with my already greater than average height further enhanced by the suit of armor I was wearing, the Chaos Marine towered over me, looking down at me and Tarek like death incarnate, before sheer terror could freeze me into place. My instincts took over, and my body sprung into action. I brought the Slayer sword up barely in time to parry a blow toward my exposed head. I grunted at the impact, but my armor absorbed most of its strength. Then, before my enemy had time to get over his surprise at a lowly mortal not immediately getting killed, I shot him in the leg with my bolt pistol, and, as he stumbled from the explosion, which failed to penetrate his ceramite armor, struck with the Daemonblade, burying it into his chest. He twitched once, twice, then slumped over, dead, and slid off the Slayer sword, his soul falling into whatever pit of hellfire awaited him. My relief at my unlikely victory was short-lived, however, for I immediately heard the sound of more transhuman voices shouting and the thunder of armored footsteps. The Dark Brothers had found us, and while I'd been lucky enough to kill this one, I didn't believe for a moment I could reproduce that feat enough time to fight my way through the entire warband. "Run like frack," I shouted to Tarek. We ran back down the stairs as fast as we could. Tarek went first, while I covered our retreat. And if you think that doesn't sound like me, keep in mind that I had no idea where we were going and what perils might await us down below. So letting the Beastkin Prophet go first only made sense. Besides, my armor was a lot tougher than any human shield in any case. Despite panic helping make our descent much quicker than our ascent had been, it should have taken us hours to reach the bottom of the spiral. But at some point in our descent, I realized that each step was taking us much deeper into the pit than its height indicated it should. It was as if we were being pulled down by some vast, reality-bending force. As you might imagine, this wasn't a pleasant realization, but the Dark Brothers were still on our trail. That they hadn't caught up with us yet was a miracle I could only credit to that same physics-defying phenomenon. Yet I had no doubt that if we stopped running, they would catch up immediately. Between whatever unknown peril waited for us at the bottom of the pit and the certain doom that we would face if we stopped or slowed down, the choice was painfully obvious. Finally, we reached the bottom of the stairs, which, to my surprise, didn't quite reach the bottom of the pit. The steps ended next to a long outcrop that emerged from the wall and went straight over the emptiness. It was covered by a large numbers of metal panes, welded together into a tunnel barely large enough for me to walk through. For lack of another option, Tarek and I followed the path. It was bordered by an armory's worth of spears, each with a cruelly barbed blade. I counted dozens, if not hundreds of them at first glance. I was no expert, but the oldest looked like it had been there for thousands of years, covered in rust to the point it was a miracle it was still standing up. Every single weapon was still covered in blood. On the oldest specimens, the blood was barely visible as a darker stain on the rusted blade. It was as if each spear had been added to the display immediately after being used in combat. I do not mind admitting being unnerved by the display. The spears didn't look like anything which should be used in actual warfare. If not for the blood on their blades, I would have thought them purely ceremonial. Instead, this made me think of the trophy display of some lunatic murderer, which, as you'll readily understand, didn't fill me with confidence regarding what we were about to find. At the end of the path was a large gate blocking our advance, forged of a black material with blood-red engravings of more of the chaotic runes I had seen on the altars above. The gate was surrounded by rusted shafts planted into the stone bridge, which I assumed to be more spears. The first, judging by the fact the weapons had gotten more and more rusted the further in we went. It looked like there was a way through the shafts, though walking through it without cutting oneself would require the Emperor's own luck. I didn't bother with it, merely smashing my way through, the rusted metal breaking apart against my armor and Tarek following behind me. The door was locked, of course. A bunch of silver chains, also covered in crimson runes, I noted absent-mindedly. The Brotherhood's decorators were consistent, if nothing else, were wrapped around the heavy metallic door, wrapped around a singular lock, which looked like something out of a heretical locksmith's nightmares. There was a keyhole shaped like a mouth, though I suspected there was more than artistic license at play. "Get behind me," I told Tarek, drawing the Slayer sword from where I'd sheathed it to run faster. Before my common sense could reassert itself and force me to consider what I was doing, I slashed at the chains, and the Daemonblade cut right through them. The links fell to the ground with a sound that was entirely too loud for their physical weight to cause, while at the same time I felt a shiver down my spine that had nothing to do with my habitual state of borderline panic, and the spears around us rattled as if shaken by some unseen and unfelt wind. Clearly, cutting the chains had meant more than simply opening the way forward, an impression further confirmed by what became visible once the heavy metallic doors swung inward, a swirl of multicolored light which could have screamed warpcraft any clearer. I broke off a piece of one of the spears and tentatively threw it at the lights. When vanished without so much as a ripple, I tried again, this time with a longer fragment, which I pushed halfway through before pulling it back. It was intact, so whatever was on the other side of the warp gate, for that was what it must be, wasn't immediately lethal. Given the option, I still would much rather not go through it, you understand. An environment that didn't immediately destroy a rusted piece of metal still left plenty of options for possible dangers open. But the sound of armored footsteps kept getting closer, and there was no cover in sight. Walking through the metal tunnel would be difficult for the Chaos Marines, but not impossible. And the moment they got a line of sight on us, it would be my power armor against their bolters, weapons which, according to the stories Hector had told me, had been modified at the dawn of the heresy to be able to pierce through ceramite. So I wasn't willing to bet my life on my suit's ability to resist more than a few shots. "Well," I told Tarek, "nothing ventured, nothing gained." He nodded, pale-faced, and we jumped into the swirling portal together. For a brief moment, I heard something like the distant roar of massive engines and felt the breath of something unthinkably large on my face. And then we were through. The pair of us stumbled on a large circular platform of some smooth, white material that was tough enough not to be marked by my falling on my armored hands and knees. It was vast, easily hundreds of meters across, and lit by a bunch of floating purple-blue torches that formed a perfect circle several meters above our heads, held in place by nothing I could see. Sorcery, then, but I had other things to worry about, because as I looked up at them, I saw that around, beneath and above the platform was nothing. Nothing at all. Only a blackness that went beyond the mere absence of light. The closest thing I could think of was my recent experience with the webway, but even that comparison felt short. Based on what little Militia had been willing to share about the labyrinthine dimension, it had been built by some impossibly ancient Xenos race, long before mankind had first crawled out of the slime on old Earth. This felt like something had been removed, destroyed, completely and utterly, like we stood inside the cosmic equivalent of a shell crater, where someone had decided to put up a tent for some god's forsaken reason. It was not a pleasant sensation, but there didn't seem to be anything immediately threatening my life, so I could deal with it for now. "Where are we?" asked Tarek, sounding awestruck and more than a little terrified, which was fair enough, as I felt the same. "I have absolutely no idea," I replied. I tried sending a message through my Ansible communicator, but the device wasn't working. It had happened in the webway too, but also inside the governor's palace on Adumbria, where the warp saturation had reached such a level the very laws of physics on which the Ansible network relied had stopped working properly. I wasn't a psyker, so I couldn't tell which reason applied at the moment. Next to me, Tarek appeared spooked, but not physically ill. So, if his prophetic abilities were indeed psychic in nature, he wasn't being affected. "Look," said Tarek, pointing a finger toward the center of the platform. Following his lead, I saw that there was something which looked like a human silhouette there, held in a kneeling position with their arms held out horizontally to the side by a web of chains tightly wrapped around their torso and upper limbs. "How interesting," I said, concealing my fear behind a mask of dispassionate curiosity. "It appears this place is a prison of some kind, though who the Brotherhood of Darkness could wish to confine in such a way eludes me. Whoever they are, we need to set them free," said Tarek in a determined tone. I felt a lot more ambivalent, but going closer to the center of the platform also put more distance between us and the portal, so I followed Tarek. In addition, I had to keep up the image of the caring leader, or risk alienating Tarek, and it was possible his desire to free the chained figure was partially due to his prophetic abilities subconsciously telling him this was a good idea. Though given my luck, it was far more likely he just objected to seeing anyone in chains after spending a lifetime as part of an oppressed underclass. I was relieved that our pursuers didn't emerge through right behind us, but it was a mixed relief, because it raised the question of why they wouldn't follow us. I focused my attention on the captive at the center of the platform, who was the most likely reason I could think of. As we approached, it became clear that the Brotherhood's prisoner was a human female. Her skin was dark, but sunken in. She looked to be barely in her teens, but it was difficult to say for sure, since she reminded me of the starving folks from the underhive of my birth world, whose emaciated faces had haunted me for years, even after I had been pulled from my true destiny as a humble conman and bar owner by the Imperium and thrown into the Schola Progenium. Her skeletal frame was barely covered by a bunch of dirty rags, which looked like they had been ripped from the corpse of someone who died at the hands of an experienced torturer before being thrown on her. It may have been a toga at some point, but there were more holes than intact material in it, and so much of it appeared to have been charred by fire that it was impossible to tell what its original color had been. What little of her skin I could see under the dried-out gore appeared untouched, but this couldn't possibly be healthy. A ritual circle surrounded her, of a complexity beyond anything I had previously encountered. Carved into the white floor, it made the work of the Tzientchian and Slaneshi Magi I regularly and reluctantly associated with look like the scribbles of a bored juvie. I thrust my arm in front of Tarek, keeping him from crossing the edge. The chains holding the prisoner were anchored at regular intervals along the circle. As I looked at them, I had to blink and check that, yes, I wasn't seeing things. Somehow, each length of chain appeared to fuse with the others so that it was possible to follow one length and end up at any of the other anchoring points, despite the blatant impossibility of such a thing. I tore my gaze away after a few minutes of trying to make sense of it, mentally filling it at yet more warpcraft and nothing I wanted to understand. "Hello, miss," I called out to the girl. "Can you hear me?" Slowly, as if straining against an impossible weight, she raised her shaven head and stared at us. For a few seconds, her gaze was utterly blank. Then a spark of something like curiosity appeared in her golden eyes, though it was hard to be sure given the distance between us. She didn't say anything, and after a few seconds, her head fell back down and she slumped against her chains, as if that simple gesture had exhausted her. "We can't leave her here, Cain," said Tarek. I hesitated. Between the circle and the fact the Dark Brothers hadn't followed us, this was looking more and more like a trap to me. My palms were itching, and I let my hand fall onto the handle of the Slayer sword at my hip. I seized, suddenly overcome by an all-consuming flare of red-hot pain. I felt my muscles seize, and something hot and hateful poured up my arm and across my body. It felt like molten bronze going up my veins, except with teeth. "Cain? Cain!" With a groan of agony, I felt my legs start to move forward, crossing the carved circle even as my right arm betrayed me and drew the Slayer sword. The weapon demanded the girl's skull. Its hunger blazed like a raging bonfire. It, wanted to kill her, to spill her blood all across the white floor, to add her skull to Khorne's throne, and her soul to be devoured by the god of war. Despite having been warned by Arilu that something like this was a possibility, I had been caught completely by surprise. The Slayer sword had never done anything like this since I had managed to trick Uzul and shoot the Herald of Khorne in the head. I had let my guard down, and now, as it forced me to advance toward the chained girl trapped in the eldritch basement of the Brotherhood of Darkness, it seemed I was going to damn myself for it. Though my vision was darkened, I saw the girl raise her head again as I approached. At first, she displayed only complete apathy until her gaze fell on the Slayer sword, at which point her face contorted into an expression I recognized only too well: terror. I fought against the Daemonblade's command, trying to force my body to stop moving, but I could only watch in growing horror as my own arm raised the Slayer sword for a decapitating strike. "Stop this, Cain!" And then Tarek was on me, climbing atop me to try to push my arm down. Compared to the strength my power armor gave me, Tarek's efforts were almost meaningless. But almost could still be sufficient if you were using enough explosives. As my old scholar combat instructor used to say, and the Beastkin's efforts gave me just enough time to muster one final burst of desperate willpower. I screamed, my voice bursting out of my throat, and just barely managed to divert the blow at the last moment so that it landed on one of the girl's chains instead of her neck. The thick, rune-covered metal was sundered in a single strike, and I heard the Daemonblade scream in frustration inside my skull, even as Tarek fell off my arm and rolled to his feet, miraculously avoiding to cut himself on Slayer's sword as he did so. Recoiling from Tarek and the girl both, I stalked all the way to the very edge of the platform, my hand still grasped around the Daemonblade's handle. All the while, it kept pulling at me, demanding that I go back and take the girl's skull. But its hold over me had been broken, and now that I was on guard against it, it couldn't steal back control as easily as it had the first time. "Enough," I growled, knowing the weapon could hear me. My anger was keeping the fear I would normally feel at standing so close to the emptiness in check, and I took advantage of it, thrusting my arm above the void with a snarl of defiance. At once, the compulsion to go back and kill the Brotherhood's captive vanished. "I will drop you. Do you hear me?" I threatened. "Do not think I am bluffing. Whatever your problem with that girl is, you cannot have her. You cannot have anyone I do not give you willingly. And if you try to force the matter, God's help me, I will drop you into this abyss. I don't know where we are exactly, but I have a feeling not even you would be able to escape from this place then. Admittedly, it was a rather big assumption to make, but I wasn't exactly in the proper state of mind to question my guts. No jumping into my hand when I draw another blade, I continued. No returning to the warp to be reforged by the blood god smiths. Only an eternity of plunging into infinite darkness without ever tasting combat again. And if you think you can try again once we are out of here, know that the moment we're off this benighted world, I will have my Magi design a ward that can alert me the moment you try to subvert my will. And if you ever trigger it, I will not pause until I have found a way to break this bond which was forced upon me, even if it means throwing you in a Rilu's vault and never using a sword again. I felt the rage radiating from the Slayer's sword, but it couldn't hide the fear its infernal spirit also felt at my threat. To an entity like it, created at the foot of the skull throne for the sole purpose of violence, the prospect of an eternity of silence was unbearable. From my discussions with Aurelu and Harold, I knew that the Daemonblade wasn't truly sentient in the way Emily or Uzul were, but it was possessed of the same kind of low intellect as a canid, and I knew it could understand my threat. In truth, I was badly tempted to take this opportunity and get rid of the weapon once and for all anyway. But not only was I nowhere as certain this would work as I was making it sound, there was also the fact that I was still trapped deep within the Brotherhood of Darkness's stronghold, having just stumbled upon what I had to assume was one of their most tightly guarded secrets. Abandoning a weapon as powerful as the Slayer sword wasn't going to help my already slim chances of survival. That being said, neither would being at constant risk of sudden possession by the weapon. If it refused to submit, or I had any doubt it would renege on the accord I was forcing onto it now, then I would drop it and make do with my bolt pistol and my wits from this point on. The Slayer sword must have felt my resolve, if not the reasoning behind it. I felt its reluctant acceptance, the closest thing to a promise it could give. With a sigh, I put it back into its scabbard, feeling an unspeakable sense of relief when my hand finally let go of the handle and turned back to where Tarek was comforting the young girl, who was staring at me with a mix of shock, relief, and fear, the last of which sent a spear of guilt through my heart, which at least proved I still had my soul. "My apologies, miss," I said to her with an apologetic smile. "That sword of mine is a little temperamental, shall we say. I promise you this won't happen again." She didn't look convinced, which was fair enough. I certainly wouldn't have believed me in her position. She opened her mouth and tried to speak, but no words left her mouth. only a rasping gargle. It was like she had forgotten how to speak after so long in isolation. I felt a pang of sympathy, but forced myself to suppress it and not let it affect my judgment. There was clearly more to this young waif than met the eye. The Brotherhood wouldn't have imprisoned her here otherwise, and the Slayer's sword wouldn't have tried to force me to kill her. For all I knew, she was some powerful demon host the Brotherhood had trapped beneath their lair, and, now that I'd broken her chains, was about to turn into a monster to rival Hash-Ag-Gik and eat us both before clawing her way out of this anomalous space and go on a vengeful rampage. Nevertheless, I didn't regret not letting the Slayer sword kill her. Even if she was some kind of infernal abomination, letting the weapon get away with taking control of my body for any reason was a path that led nowhere good. Of that, I was absolutely certain. Come to think of it, I did have one way to check quickly whether the girl was human or not. And since she clearly felt more at ease around Tarek than me, I even had a reason to have someone else risk his life while doing so. "Tarek," I called out, "I think our young friend could use a dose of panacea. Do you still have yours?" "Oh," the beastkin blinked. "You're right. I completely forgot. Yes, I still have mine. Give me a moment." He reached into his bag for a few seconds, then pulled out a panacea injector with a triumphant "ha ha." But as he approached the girl with the injector in hand, she skittered away from him, eyeing the device in his hand distrustfully. Right. The last time she'd been injected with anything, the ones holding the injector probably hadn't had her best interests in mind. Fortunately, Tarek had a solution in mind. He took out another injector, held the two of them in front of him for a few seconds, making sure she could see them both before putting them down on the ground, pulling out a knife, cutting himself in the left arm with only a slight twitch, then jamming one of the injectors near the injury. Strictly speaking, it was a waste of a dose of panacea, but I understood what he was doing. By injecting himself with the stuff, he was demonstrating that it wasn't dangerous. It appeared to work, as when he approached the girl with the other injector, she let him jab it into her arm, albeit with great reluctance, which promptly melted away as the panacea got to work. As it did so, I took stock of my own condition. Despite how short it had been, the attempted possession had nearly crippled me, as the Slayer's sword hadn't been delicate while puppeteering my body and had torn plenty of my muscles as it tried to force me to kill the Brotherhood's prisoner. Thankfully, my armor's auto-injector had given me a dose of panacea at once, so my internal injuries were already gone, leaving only a strange kind of full-body stiffness that was rapidly fading. Once the dose's effects had finished, the girl still looked like she needed several good meals, a few baths, a change of clothes, and plenty of rest. But the scars and scabs that had been visible through her rags had gone, and she was staring at where they had been with the wide-eyed look typical of someone witnessing the wonders of the panacea for the first time. "Tarek!" I called out, removing the cape attached to the back of my armor and holding it in his direction. "Can you give this to our young friend? It isn't much, but it will cover her better than these rags her captors have left her with." Though the girl was much bigger than Zariah had been when I'd carried her out of the Nurglite temple on Adumbria, she was thin enough that my cape wrapped around her nicely. She stroked the fabric with wide eyes, mesmerized by its smoothness and cleanliness, and I forced my teeth to unclench. As she did so, Tarek approached me and asked softly, while looking at the portal through which we'd entered this strange place, "We've been in here for some time now. Why do you think they didn't follow us?" "My best guess is that this place has some kind of religious significance," I replied, just as quietly. It certainly matched the way this particular breed of lunatics had behaved so far, and the path leading to the gate had certainly looked like it could be some sort of demented shrine, with the rusted spears as offerings. Of course, that only raised more questions as to the girl's nature and the reasons for her imprisonment down here. The more pressing question, however, was what to do now. The portal through which we had come was the only way in and out of this place. So even if the Dark Brothers didn't want to enter for one reason or another, they just needed to put a few warriors outside and wait for us to starve or get out. We could still wait and hope that the rest of the strike team would succeed in stopping the Brotherhood's plans before coming to our rescue. While I had nothing against the idea in principle, indeed, I found it deeply appealing. It wasn't without its own risks. At any moment, the Brotherhood could decide that our presence here outweighed whatever restrictions were keeping them at bay. For all I knew, the Dark Brothers pursuing us had called in for someone more important, and thus, given the way Chaos war bands tended to be organized, more dangerous, to come deal with the situation, whether by giving them permission to enter this place or by coming in themselves. I was still considering our meager options when the former captive of the Brotherhood suddenly rose to her feet, taking a few hesitant steps on trembling legs, her face twisted into a grimace of pained determination. I had no idea how long she'd been trapped on her knees by her chains, incapable of moving, but the panacea had taken care of enough of the muscle atrophy for her to be able to stand at least. That was good, since it would make her less of a burden to our escape. Then she waved her hands in front of her, and an archway of bright light appeared before her, large enough for someone to step through. Smiling, she turned to look at Tarek and I, gesturing at the archway she had just created. "Do you think that's an exit?" asked the Prophet, after a few seconds of the two of us gawking like underhive rubes at a carnival. It does seem likely, I agreed cautiously, my mind whirling with the implications. The girl possessing some kind of psychic ability would explain the wards that had been carved into the floor, as the chains alone would have been enough to restrain an ordinary human, and she would need to be a potent psyker to warrant such measures in the first place. Assuming she was feeling grateful for her freedom and the injection of panacea, the portal she'd created presumably led outside somewhere safe. We had no idea where exactly, though, and no way of asking her, since she was still mute, even after the panacea had done its work. Meaning, from my experience with the stuff, that the cause was at least partially psychological. But the alternative was staying here, in the same space as a psyker of unknown but potent capabilities. Even Jürgen wasn't capable of casually breaking space to create a portal, and my aide was the strongest combat psyker in the Protectorate, at least until Lucia reached adulthood, and whom I'd have given more reasons to be wary of me. "We have to go through," I said reluctantly, once I was done thinking about it. "I will go first. You'll follow behind me, after making sure she comes with you." "Are you sure?" asked Tarek. "It's the most tactically sensible option," I replied with a shrug. And it was. If there were dark brothers on the other side, I doubted Tarek would be able to do much to slow them down, and I couldn't exactly ask the newly revealed psyker to go first. Going first meant that I would still have the advantage of surprise on who and whatever was on the other side, as well as the promise of distractions on the way. Judging by the Beastkin's expression, he clearly interpreted my decision very differently, but I didn't have the heart to disillusion him as to my motives. I took a deep breath, then stepped into the light, throwing myself at the mercy of sorcery I only vaguely understood for the third time this day. The sensation was similar to when I'd gone through the portal leading to this strange prison, though a lot more comfortable. By which I mean, it was like being shaken senseless by an ogrin instead of smashed in the head by one with a metal pipe. That, and looking directly at a plasma reactor, as the portal's brightness was such that, even with my eyes closed in advance, it took several very tense seconds of me blinking frantically for my vision to clear, during which I had to rely solely on my hearing to tell me there was no one else in my immediate surroundings. Immediately, I started hearing chanting from somewhere close by, in a tongue I didn't speak nor recognize, but whose words caused a shiver to run down my spine. "Aksho karneth akash, Aksho slaneth kakar, Aksho zenith theos, Aksho nurgleth dach, Ksilakash daos akamshi chaos akshomi." Well, that certainly didn't sound promising.